Before Rome, before Babylon, there was Akkad. A child abandoned in a basket rose to become the first emperor in history. Sargon of Akkad built an empire that united Mesopotamia for the first time. His armies conquered, his governors ruled, and his name echoed across the land. But rebellion, invasion, and betrayal brought it crashing down. This is the story of the world's first empire, and the man who created it. In the heart of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved life into the desert, a child was cast into the waters. His mother, a temple priestess, was forbidden to raise him. With no other choice, she placed him in a reed basket and let the current carry him away. The boy's fate could have ended there, lost to the river, but destiny had other plans. A gardener discovered the basket, lifted the crying child from the water, and raised him as his own. That boy would grow into the man known as Sargon of Akkad, the first true emperor in human history. The world he was born into was divided. Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, was a land of warring city-states. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Kish. Each was proud, independent, and constantly at war with its neighbors. Kings fought over canals, fertile fields, and temple riches. Alliances rose and crumbled within years. For centuries, no ruler had been strong enough to unite them all. The very idea of an empire seemed impossible. Sargon grew up in Kish, serving as cupbearer to the king. This role, though humble in title, gave him rare access to the heart of power. He poured the king's wine, listened to conversations between generals and priests, and learned the art of politics. More importantly, he studied the weaknesses of kings who thought themselves untouchable. Sargon was ambitious, but he was patient. He understood that to rise, he had to wait for the right moment. That moment came when Kish itself was shaken by conflict. Sargon gathered loyal supporters and rose in rebellion. His courage and cunning carried him to victory. With Kish under his control, he turned his eyes to an even greater rival, Lugalzagizi of Uruk, the most powerful king in all of Sumer. The clash was brutal, but Sargon's army prevailed. In a spectacle that shocked the land, he paraded Lugalzagizi in chains through the sacred city of Nippur, offering him to the gods as proof that the old order had ended. From that moment forward, Sargon was no longer just a king. He was the master of all Sumer. He built a new capital, Akkad, a city so great that its ruins are still lost beneath the sands of time. From its palaces and temples, Sargon declared himself king of the four quarters of the world. This was more than a title. It was a proclamation of something entirely new. No longer would rulers simply claim a single city or region. Now, one man dared to claim dominion over the entire known world. For the people of Mesopotamia, this was a revolution. They had always lived under local kings, tied to the walls of their own cities. But now, they were subjects of something larger than they had ever known, an empire. And at its heart was a man who had once been a nameless child floating down a river. Sargon's victory over the Sumerian city-states was only the beginning. To keep power, he knew he needed more than luck, more than charisma. He needed a system strong enough to control lands far beyond what any king had ruled before. And so, he built something the world had never seen, a professional standing army. For centuries, Mesopotamian wars had been fought by farmers and craftsmen summoned during planting or harvest off-seasons. They were strong men, but they lacked training and discipline. When the battle ended, they returned home to their plows and workshops. Sargon changed everything. His soldiers were permanent, full-time warriors. They trained year-round, lived by the sword, and swore loyalty not to a single city but to Akkad itself. This army became the backbone of his empire and the tool of his unrelenting expansion. With this force, Sargon marched beyond the borders of Sumer. City after city fell. Uruk, Lagash, once proud rivals, now humbled under his banner. But conquest did not stop at Mesopotamia. His armies pushed north into Assyria, east into the highlands of Elam, and westward all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. It was said that ships bearing cedar wood from Lebanon and silver from Anatolia now sailed under Akkadian protection. For the first time, distant regions that had never shared a common ruler found themselves bound together. Yet an empire could not survive on conquest alone. Sargon was as much a strategist in governance as he was in battle. To manage his vast territories, he appointed trusted officials, often family members, as governors of conquered lands. Each reported back to Akkad, sending taxes, tribute, and soldiers when needed. Trade routes were secured, laws standardized, and canals maintained. The lifeblood of the empire flowed smoothly back to its beating heart. Akkad itself became a jewel of the ancient world. Though its ruins remain lost beneath Mesopotamian sands, records describe it as a city of wealth and splendor. Markets overflowed, with goods from across the known world: lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Oman, timber from Lebanon, and grain from the fertile plains of Sumer. Merchants and travelers crowded its streets, speaking different tongues but united under one system. Culturally, the Akkadian Empire fused traditions. The Sumerian language, rich with hymns and myths, blended with Akkadian, a Semitic tongue, creating a new literary and administrative standard. Scribes wrote in cuneiform, recording not only taxes and trade but also poetry, proverbs, and epic tales. Art flourished too, with stone carvings showing Sargon as a mighty king blessed by the gods. For 56 years, Sargon ruled. His name inspired both awe and fear, carried far beyond the borders of Mesopotamia. He was no longer just a conqueror. He was the architect of a system that redefined human civilization. He had proven that cities could be bound together into something greater, an empire that stretched across rivers, mountains, and deserts. But as the empire grew, so too did its burdens. Rebellions simmered beneath the surface. Enemies watched from the mountains and deserts, waiting for weakness. Sargon had built the first empire, but the question lingered: could it last beyond him? The Akkadian Empire, born from Sargon's ambition and held together by his brilliance, stretched farther than any kingdom the world had ever known. But the wider an empire grows, the harder it is to keep intact. With every victory, new challenges emerged. Rebellions smoldered in conquered cities. Enemies watched hungrily from the mountains and deserts, and the sheer size of the empire threatened to collapse under its own weight. Even during Sargon's lifetime, he faced more than 30 uprisings. Former rivals, cities like and Lagash, resented being ruled by Akkad. They had their own kings, their own gods, their own pride. Though Sargon's armies crushed revolt after revolt, the resentment never truly vanished. It lingered like fire beneath ash, ready to burst again. After Sargon's death, the crown passed to his sons and then to his grandson, Naram-Sin. He was a fierce and ambitious ruler, determined not only to preserve what his grandfather had built, but to expand it even further. To project authority, he took a bold step no Mesopotamian king had taken before. He declared himself a living god. In inscriptions, he is shown wearing a horned crown, a symbol reserved for the divine. To his followers, this was a statement of strength. To his enemies, it was arrogance beyond measure. For a time, Naram-Sin's gamble worked. He crushed the Lulubi mountain tribes, expanded into new territories, and claimed even greater glory for Akkad. His empire reached its greatest extent under his reign. But power breeds resistance. The more Akkad demanded from its provinces, taxes, soldiers, tribute, the more discontent grew. Local rulers who had once submitted now whispered of independence. And from the Zagros Mountains to the deserts of Yiu, the west, nomadic tribes prowled like wolves, waiting for their chance to strike. Then came what later generations called the Curse of Akkad. A series of devastating droughts swept across Mesopotamia. The once fertile rivers and fields could no longer feed the people. Famine spread, cities starved, and the gods seemed silent. To many, it appeared that Akkad's own ruler had offended the divine. Stories written centuries later blamed Naram-Sin directly, claiming that by declaring himself a god, he had angered the heavens and brought ruin upon his people. Whether the droughts were natural disaster or divine punishment, their effect was undeniable. They weakened the empire. Hungry people were harder to control, and rebellions flared with greater fury. Armies once feared across the known world now struggled to maintain order. The empire that had seemed invincible was now stretched thin, battered by nature, and haunted by unrest. And in the shadows of the Zagros Mountains, the Gutians, a hardy, restless people, watched the Akkadians suffering with interest. Their time was coming. The question was no longer whether the empire could expand, but whether it could survive at all. The Akkadian Empire had been built on vision, strength, and discipline. But as the decades passed, cracks began to spread through its foundations. The empire was vast, and its rulers demanded much from their subjects: taxes, tribute, soldiers, and loyalty. For the conquered cities, these demands felt like chains. Many waited patiently for a moment of weakness, and when it came, they would break free. That weakness arrived after years of famine and rebellion. The Akkadian army, once unstoppable, was now exhausted and stretched thin across distant territories. And from the east, across the rugged Zagros Mountains, came a new threat: the Gutians. They were not like the settled peoples of Mesopotamia. They were mountain tribes, fierce, mobile, and relentless. For years they had watched the Akkadian Empire grow fat and weary. Now, as drought and unrest tore it apart, the Gutians struck. The invasion was devastating. The Gutians swept down into the fertile plains, plundering towns and cutting trade routes. Cities that had once trembled at the name of Akkad now turned to the Gutians, offering allegiance in exchange for freedom. But the greatest betrayal came not from foreign invaders. It came from within. Regional governors, tired of serving Iai, distant capital, abandoned their loyalty. Some declared themselves kings, others sided with the Gutians. The unity Sargon had forged began to unravel city by city, province by province. The Akkadian kings who followed Naram-Sin struggled desperately to hold on. They fought battle after battle, but every victory was hollow. No sooner was one rebellion crushed than another would ignite elsewhere. Without the full loyalty of its subjects, the empire was like a clay tablet, appearing solid, yet fragile enough to crumble with the slightest pressure. The once glorious capital of Akkad itself became a ghost. Later Mesopotamian stories spoke of its fall with sorrow and bitterness, describing empty temples, dried canals, and fields abandoned to dust. Though its location is still lost to history, its memory survived as a warning of what happens when empire collapses. The Gutians, who had struck the final blow, proved themselves poor rulers. They had no experience in governing a settled civilization. Trade slowed, cities declined, and Mesopotamia entered what later scribes called a dark age. Temples went neglected, literacy waned, and the grandeur of the Sumerian Akkadian world seemed to fade into silence. For nearly a century, chaos ruled where once Sargon's empire had flourished. The dream of unity had ended in betrayal. Betrayal by governors who abandoned their posts, betrayal by allies who turned on Akkad, and perhaps even betrayal by the gods themselves, if the legends of the curse of Akkad are to be believed. The empire that had begun with such promise, the empire that had united the known world under one ruler, was gone. Its fall was not sudden, like a city sacked overnight. It was a slow, painful unraveling, a reminder that empires are not destroyed, only by enemies at their gates, but also by cracks that begin within. The Akkadian Empire may have fallen, but its story did not end in ruins. In many ways, its collapse marked the beginning of something far greater, the idea of empire itself. Sargon and his descendants showed the world that it was possible to unite diverse peoples, languages, and lands under a single crown. Though Akkad's capital was lost to time, the memory of its power shaped civilizations for centuries to come. Administratively, the Akkadians had pioneered a model that later empires would copy and perfect. Sargon's decision to place governors over conquered regions, tied directly to the central capital, became a blueprint for future rulers. Tribute and taxation systems, military garrisons in key cities, and the use of professional soldiers, these were all innovations that outlived the empire. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, and even the mighty Persians built their empires upon foundations first laid by Akkad. Culturally, the Akkadians left behind a rich legacy. They spread their language, which became the lingua franca of diplomacy and administration across Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years. Even when Akkad itself was gone, scribes continued to write in Akkadian cuneiform. Literature flourished, with myths, epics, and hymns preserved in clay tablets. The Akkadian and Sumerian traditions blended so closely that later generations could not imagine one without the other. Myths about Akkad's fall also carried powerful lessons. The Curse of Akkad, written centuries later, told how Naram-Sin had angered the gods by declaring himself divine. As punishment, famine, invasion, and chaos followed until the empire was destroyed. Whether this tale was fact or fiction, it became a cautionary story for kings who came after. It warned rulers of the dangers of arrogance, the fragility of power, and the importance of keeping faith with the divine. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Akkad was its symbol, the story of Sargon himself. A boy abandoned on a river, raised by a gardener, rising from nothing to become the ruler of the known world. His journey inspired generations. Centuries later, echoes of his story appeared in other traditions, like the tale of Moses, another child set adrift in a basket who rose to greatness. To many, Sargon became the archetype of the self-made ruler, proof that destiny could elevate even the humblest of beginnings. The Akkadian Empire lasted less than 2 centuries, a brief span in the long timeline of history. Yet in that short time, it changed humanity forever. It was the first experiment in empire, with all its triumphs and its tragedies. It showed both the heights of ambition and the perils of overreach. Though its city is buried and its kings long dead, its influence still flows through the veins of history, like the rivers that first carried Sargon to his fate. Akkad may have crumbled, but the idea of empire, of one power uniting many, was born there. And that idea would echo across ages, shaping civilizations long after the walls of Akkad had turned to dust. The Akkadian Empire lasted less than 2 centuries, but in that short time it changed the world forever. From the ambition of a boy abandoned in a river came the first vision of empire, an idea that would shape every great power after. Though Akkad itself crumbled into dust, its legacy lived on in Babylon, in Assyria, in Persia, and far beyond. The story of Sargon reminds us that greatness can rise from the humblest beginnings, and that even the mightiest empires can fall. Because, in the end, power is temporary, but the ideas we leave behind can echo through eternity.